serious problem, 1676, Virginia. Go on. Go on. We've been through this, all right. Here's when Bacon's rebellion is finally put down. There's this account which I showed you early in the session of Thomas Grantham, Grantham's account again here: 400 English and Negroes in arms. You have European Americans and African Americans fighting together for freedom from bondage. You won't see that for the next 300 years. Down south, you know, arguments can be made. Come on. Supreme proof, Allen argues, that the white race did not exist. They fought side by side for the abolition of slavery. Sean, come on. Counterfeit. So what happens in response is the ruling class turns to a counterfeit of social mobility. They're not going to promote these European American laborers out of their class, but they're going to sell them a different bill of goods, right? Instead of social mobility, European Americans were to be asked to be satisfied with the presumption of liberty, which is a birthright of everyone in England, right? You know, and with the right of adult males who own sufficient property to vote for candidates for office. Sean? Virginia General Assembly deliberately stuffed the racial distinction with anomalous privileges, right? Go on. Revised the code 1705. They granted guarantees to the European Christian servants. Now you finish your bond servitude, you're European, you get 10 bushels of corn, you get a gun. Go on, Sean. 1705. Act concerning servants and slaves in 1723. These are major laws, but they're not only passing these laws extending privileges to the European Americans and disabilities on the African Americans, but they're propagandizing it in the method of the day. This is pre-internet and TV and everything, so it's put on every parish church and wall, and sheriffs post them at the courthouse door, and it's drummed into the people. Come on, Sean. Propaganda, it was to be drummed into the minds of the people for the first time. No free African American was to dare lift a hand. African American freeholders were no longer allowed to vote. They had been allowed to, right? A reinforcement against the mating of English and Negroes, right? Provided in the 1723 law, any white person found in company with any illegally congregated slaves was to be fined or to receive lashes. Sean? 1723 Act, and this is where we really get into the nature of racial oppression. It is aimed, an act directing the trial of slaves. It's got a long title, but this is where they take away the vote of African Americans. They formally take it away, and they explain, Governor William Gooch explained that it was, the law says no free Negro, mulatto or Indian shall have any vote at the election, and Governor William Gooch explains it is to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes. Now you might ask, why free Negroes, right? You know, here we go. So Allen emphasizes, surely that's not an unthinking decision, which is what Winthrop Jordan says, right? You know, racism. Rather, it was a deliberate act by the plantation bourgeoisie. Sean? In addition, that Act of 1723, I'm going to come back to it in a second, other aspects of it, it had laws against free African Americans, including making Negro women titleable, how to pay taxes for them, forbidding of non-Europeans to be owners of Christians, denying free African Americans right to hold any office, excluding African Americans from the armed militia, that's the Lily White Slave Patrol, forbidding free African Americans from possessing any gun, powder, shot, or any club. Next, Sean. The denial of the right to self-defense would become a major factor in the peculiar American form of male supremacy, white male supremacy, which held that any European American male could assume familiarity because African Americans were not allowed to defend themselves. Sean, next. Why the exclusion of free African Americans? The real reason for the exclusion of free African Americans from the intermediate stratum was a corollary of the establishment of white identity. If you're not going to promote these laboring class European Americans out of their class, you got to give them something, you know, sell them something. So they're selling them this white identity, and the white identity has to exclude the African Americans. So this is part of the reason why the racial prescription. Come on. And this is what we see today. I mean, well, people can get into, you know, why the exclusion of, the mere presumption of liberty was to serve as social status. The presumption of liberty had to be denied to free African Americans. Next, John. How was it done? They were the white European Americans were enlisted in a system of social control, not by class interest, but by being promoted to the white race, Sean. The white race social control formation, Allen then argues, we're almost at the end of the book now, as a model. It was reinvented in ensuing southern colonies. In Virginia, Maryland would serve as the model for succeeding plantation settlement. Next. The poor and populous European Americans became principal elements in the enforcement of racial oppression. The white slave patrols were made up primarily of laboring class people, Sean. Labor is not promoted out of their class. Here's statistics. Remember Morgan writes that there are too few Freeporter matter? Here's the stats from other historians, which ultimately argue that 60% of the adult white male population were not owners of bond labor and were in direct competition, laboring, small landholders. They couldn't compete with the plantation elite. Come on, John. The decision was driven, different ways would be required. He talks about different ways of Sean will come. I want to go fast here. He again emphasizes the difference in the social control and the status of free coloreds and mulattoes in the West Indies opposed to the U.S., and it reflects different forms that the class struggle took. Sean. He again highlights, as he did at the end of the first volume, that after emancipation, the northern bourgeoisie opts again to reestablish a system of racial oppression, which he says, if I don't have it here, I have it on the next page, which he uses the phrase, and they set up a system of slavery in all but name, whatever that book is that's out there now. You see the phrase here 15 years earlier. Free land, immigration, industrial employment is where they set up the white privilege policies. It goes into some detail on Negro Exodus of 1879, which gets beat back by terror. Cotton Mill Campaign, Lily White Cotton Mill Campaign in the South. Sean? He's closing in 1997. That's when he finishes the volume, and he sums up here. But what he wrote in 1907 could have been written yesterday. This is what we see right now. At the end of the 20th century, the social gap between the Titans and the common people is at its historic maximum. Real wages have tended down. Entitlements and welfare, all the code words, have become obscenities. There is less of a socialist movement today than 100 years ago. Class struggle is an epithet. People don't even utter the word, right? We don't even talk working class. Next, John. He looked forward, however, to a time when the great safety valve of white skin privileges may finally come to be seen and rejected. He described unmistakable signs, this is Allen at the end of the book, of maturing social conflict, and he emphasized the importance that why things were different now than previously is the indelible mark left by that civil rights, black liberation movement. We had the way forward pointed. Last few slides, Sean. Okay, his final words, perhaps by virtue of that legacy, the great safety valve of white skin privileges may be seen and rejected. The incubus, an incubus is a devil, the incubus that for 3 centuries has paralyzed the will of these European American workers in defense of their class interests. Sean, shortly before his death, Allen offered 4 recommendations for work forward. Sean, I want to go on now. I want the last 3 slides. So here he is wrapping it up, Sean. Looking further, I would point people again as we leave. I would hope you would remember the lessons of the 3 previous crises, what he elaborated, and how in each and every one they beat us back by turns to white supremacy. Sean, if you can, remember that 5-stage cycle and how stage 3, as people start coming together, there's going to be conscious efforts to divide us on white supremacy, white privilege. Sean, next. The crucial importance of anti-white supremacist working class struggle at all stages, but particularly stage 3 and 4. Sean, keep in mind that the struggle has to be led by anti-white supremacist proletarian class hegemony. Sean, remember, last 2 slides, remember the insights of Hubert Harris and my suggestions, that politically the Negro is a touchstone, and that true democracy and equality implies a revolution startling to even think of. It hits at the core of how they do it, and if we push in that direction, we're going to open many doors. And finally, John, remember, Allen, the white race is created and maintained as a social control formation. It is the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination in the U.S. It reinforced among Europeans by white skin privileges, and efforts at radical social change should understand and reflect the centrality of struggle against white supremacy. That's it. Wow.
presentation. I do appreciate that. I was having a hard time trying to relate the more ancient oppression of Western Europe when it came to the rest of the world. How does that relate to this whole white supremacy thing?
The more ancient oppression, you mean of Europeans going elsewhere in the world?
Colonizing and doing those types of things. Whereas I see, when I look back at all the history that I can recall, I see that European countries were able to come together at some point to help oppress other people. For example, Africa. There was a conference in which, you know, France and Belgium and all these countries came together to colonize and, you know, split the difference in Africa and oppress these people. And so when you're talking about the myth of the white race, it seems as if it always existed, regardless of the language.
Well, I think what you're talking about, if you're talking about in the 19th century when they come up about the division of Africa, that's kind of a later period. Alan's really not discussing that one. He's trying to talk, and I just want to be clear, he's not talking about the myth of the white race. He's saying the white race is real, it functions. It's a political reality. It's not biological, you know, it's created, right? And he even says reinvented and recreated. But I think it's become, in answer to your question also, I think because of particularly increasingly the U.S.'s powerful role, right, as a leading imperialist power in the world, you know, it spreads these ideas also, right? And other people, perhaps you know, Nellie in front of you, people like, you know, people write a lot more knowledgeably than I about, you know, all of this involvement around the world. What Alan's trying to focus on, I think, is he's trying to look at domestically, particularly, you know, what do we got to do to push this struggle forward? How are we going to deal with this white supremacy, which is so central to how they maintain control, not only over us, but then enabling them to do all this damage around the world. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I'm trying. Yeah.
So you had a model, you were talking about the difference between U.S. and the Caribbean,
yes,
and the number of whites compared to darker skinned peoples. How does that model compare to what happened in South Africa under apartheid when you had a majority of darker skinned people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Alan's again focusing here, you know, but he's talking about social control for the most part in stable civil societies rather than just by pure military force, which is more what you had in South Africa, right? Which is what you had, you know, under apartheid, right? So in neither of these two volumes does he really get into that, and I think people who do work in those areas, you know, could shed light on it, but. And I'm not sure fully, and maybe you know better than I, the demographic breakdown. My understanding is the African population was so overwhelming, right? You know, but rather than even promoting, even though they had colored status, you know, and things like that, rather than very much promotion, it was real military might and force that. And he talks in the book, I didn't get into all this because obviously I did a lot of things, but he talks about how the ruling elite makes cost-benefit analysis, whether they're going to set up military regimes and things. For instance, after the Civil War, you know, to maintain a military presence down south, the bourgeoisie didn't want to spend all that money, right, at a certain point, you know. Let's go back to the old system of social control. So, but again, in answer to your question, it's not what Alan goes into particularly in these volumes or in his body of writings that I'm very familiar with. He has some passing references occasionally to South Africa. Yes? Sorry.
Go ahead. Yes.
I'll speak loudly. So several racial theorists presume that we're now living in a post-racial society and one that is colorblind. So I was wondering what you would say to those theorists as examples that we're not living in a post-racial society, that it's not colorblind and that it's racially categorized.
If I'm going to give you a quick answer, but I actually have a whole slide that can run, you know, ready. My Developing Conjuncture article, which I've encouraged people to read, I have a statistical breakdown The basic argument I make in this book, in this early part of the article, is I show how the gap between rich and poor is widening, how poor and working people are suffering so greatly in this country, how, by all measures, Gini coefficients, how workers in this country overall are faring so poorly compared to workers in other countries where we spend the most